Thank you all for being here today. It is so wonderful to see you all. We're so glad that you could join us today. My name is Kimberly Bolero, and I'm the director of the Holocaust Education Resource and Outreach Center at Voices of Hope. This is the educational arm of Voices of Hope. And Voices of Hope itself is a Holocaust and genocide education nonprofit organization. So we are here for your classroom needs, in-school programming, film screenings, speakers, and sessions like this, where you can engage directly with some of our favorite authors and descendant speakers, which Daphne is both. I am so pleased for you to meet and learn from Daphne today. She is a designer, educator, researcher. She can do it all. And she has written and designed this beautiful book, Invisible Years, which tells the story of her relatives' experience of the Holocaust in the Netherlands, in which is now the Invisible Years Made Visible classroom project, which she will be presenting about today. So after we hear from Daphne, there will be time for questions and comments. And so keep those questions in mind. You can send us through the chat or we can have a conversation later. But with that, I will turn it over to Daphne. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kim, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I want to especially thank my sister, Judy Thomas. She's a first grade teacher, and when she retires next year, she's thinking that she might take this project to Pennsylvania. So this is her intro to the education part of this project. And I love working with teachers, and I love that my project changes with each teacher and class that I work with. And with that, I want to introduce, I know you all might know each other, but Colleen Sousa and Joseph Goldman. Colleen was the first teacher I worked with, and we developed the project I'm going to talk about today together for her AP Modern European History class. And then I taught with Joe, and Joe and I made changes to the project to adapt it for his genocide elective. And Colleen and Joe are going to participate in the reading of excerpts during the presentation about the book. And after I talk about the book and the project, which will take about 30 minutes, they're going to tell you a bit about the project from their perspectives as teachers who had it, who experienced it in their classroom. And as Kim mentioned, there'll be time for questions at the end. So I'm going to share my screen. You can all see that. So the classroom project in a snapshot has three parts. The first part uses the personal stories and photographs and artifacts from my book, Invisible Years. And in the book and in the project, my extended Jewish family tells about their lives under Nazi occupation in the Netherlands, about their experiences hiding, and also after liberation, the joys and sorrows that come with that. In the second part, I tell the students about an experience I had with anti-Semitism, which we just referred to. And we have a class discussion about anti-Semitism and other forms of hate in the students' online and real life communities. And for the third part, students select and explore a human rights atrocity to focus on. And during that portion, they follow my process of linking interwoven personal stories to the history of the event that they chose. They then share the projects with one another and identify patterns between the atrocities. So I'm going to come back to the classroom project after a brief look at how I got there. My profession is graphic design, and much of my work is consulting for major museums. I work with them to plan, design, and produce books, um, primarily that tell stories through art and history. I took a 4-year break from design to develop a program for teen mothers in collaboration with the Middlesex Hospital Family Advocacy Program. In that program, the young women told their stories by taking photographs and writing from them. For many years, I taught a design class at UConn in which students created and designed books that told stories about art and life, again, in words and images. And I currently work with refugees, helping them start a new chapter or a new story. So you can see a pattern. I seem to gravitate to projects where I work with others to create their stories and to help them create their stories and bring them into the world. In 2006, I was confronted with my own family story and history when the Breitling Church in Rotterdam invited my family to their 75th anniversary celebration. With that visit, it was the first time I learned that my grandparents, Chaim and Fifi de were hidden in the attic of this church for 2 years. So when I came back to the United States, I asked my mother what, I kind of knew the outlines of my family's members' experiences during the Holocaust, but I knew very little. And so that trip was the inspiration to ask. And I asked my mother to tell me more about our family history during the Holocaust. And she led me to this antique desk that had been in our house for years and opened the bottom drawer, which was filled with family members' letters, diaries, and documents telling about their experiences during the Holocaust. And one of the first things that I plucked out of the drawer was this document, and it was a miracle. It's a 49-page memoir written by my paternal grandfather while in hiding. And there was a raid on the apartment where he was in hiding, and he was murdered in Auschwitz. And throughout my life, my father never spoke about him. So with this memoir, I heard his voice for the first time. Hi, Robin. These are some others documents and diaries, letters of the over 50 primary sources that make up the book that I found in the drawer. And there are also photographs and artifacts. So with this discovery, it was time to learn who my ancestors were, what happened to them, and to tell their story, which also was a collaboration of sorts, but mostly with people who were no longer alive. My mother and aunts were the only two still living when I started the project. And a really wonderful part of working on this was getting to know the others through their writing. So the 8 family members who had left their stories and whose writings I found in the drawer became the narrators of my book. And the fact that, I'm gonna get rid of this recording. The fact that we have their voices makes me think about the voices that we don't have, like my paternal grandmother who survived by hiding as a maid in working for a non-Jewish family, hiding in plain sight. And her story, I'm sure, would be remarkable, but she didn't write it, so we don't have that. This is the family tree of the 8 narrators that are in the book. There's the de family, my maternal grandparents, Chaim and Fifi de with their 3 young daughters, Miriam, who's my mother, Judith and Hadassah. The Geismar family, my paternal grandfather, Erwin Geismar, and his son David, who's my father, and my uncle Natan Cohen. The grandparents were in their early 40s when the Germans occupied the Netherlands, and my mother, father, aunts, and uncles were children when the war started, and adolescents and teens as it went on. And so their voices really speak to the students because they're the same age. So first I had to have everything that was in Dutch and German translated, and all 3 languages had to be keyboarded. And then when everything was finally in English and typed, I printed it all out and read what I had. And it was then that I realized that the stories were kind of like pieces of a puzzle. No one person had the complete story, but together, all their stories together made it whole. And together, they really told a history of the Holocaust in the Netherlands. So, what I did is I printed everything out and cut it all up and created content groupings and then sequenced the groupings and then the excerpts within them to create this single interwoven narrative. And that became the first draft of the book. And when I first read that sequence of their interwoven voices, it was like my family members were talking to one another and like they were talking to me. And now I hear from so many people who've read the book who say it's like they are talking to me. They have that kind of connection. And even my aunt, even though she lived through this, she was a child and she didn't know many of the other stories. And when she read the book, and everyone else had died, she said, I feel like my family is around me talking to me. And when I first read this, and I listened to their conversation, I finally understood how the genocide happened and how my family members felt when they lost their rights, freedom, identity, and the people they loved. Of course, I knew about the Holocaust, but I never really got it until I read it in this form. And it's the one time that I broke down and I knew I had to share their stories beyond our family. So the first part of the classroom project follows the format of the book. And this is the table of contents. And so the the first four chapters before Trapped, Forbidden, and Separated we have the narratives' voices interwoven because they're coexisting in their homes and in their communities. And then when you get to the chapter titled Invisible, the narrators go into hiding separately. So their voices, they are isolated from one another. Their voices separate and they each have their own chapter. And those who survive and come out of hiding and are reunited in the chapter titled After, then their voices are interwoven again. This is the chapter opening for the chapter titled Forbidden. And as we know, Hitler's goal in the Netherlands was to remove Jews from Dutch society so he could incorporate the land and the Aryan population into Germany. And the removal of Jews happened over a 2-year period from 1940 to 1942. So in this chapter, we have the anti-Jewish decrees where the Nazi civil administration in the Netherlands slowly prohibited Jews from work and school, public places, transportation, communication, owning property, associating not with, they couldn't associate with non-Jews and so much more. And as my mother said, once all their rights were slowly taken away, being deported to concentration camps was just one more step of so many laws that they had to follow, or many followed. So in Forbidden, the narrators tell how these anti-Jewish orders affected their lives. So the orders are kind of, again, woven through the narrative. And so we have an order and then, or a law, and then how that law affects the narrators. And here's just a few small excerpts to give you a sense of that. April 15th, 1941, Jews are given 2 weeks' notice to surrender their radios. May 1st, 1941, Jewish professionals such as doctors, dentists, and lawyers are forbidden from serving non-Jewish clients. June 4th, 1941, Jews are prohibited from using public beaches and swimming baths and attending public markets.
After radios were confiscated in spring 1941 and we were prohibited from cafes and bars in the summer, Jews could not travel without a permit.
We were told we had to do things and we did them. The Germans were the people who could take you away and put you in prison. You did what you were told.
We wondered, why are we losing everything when we are no different from our friends who aren't Jewish?
In August 1941, before the school year started, Jewish children were forbidden from public schools. And this photograph shows Miriam's class just before the occupation. She's in the second row with the dark flower print dress. At that point, Chaim and Fifi, her parents, made arrangements to send the girls to an improvised school with Jewish teachers. And Miriam's opinion about this was.
We were about to be murdered by the Nazis, and our parents were still worried about our education.
In the spring of 1942, Jews were ordered to wear a Jewish star on their clothing. We found my Aunt Judith's Jewish star in her Holocaust drawer and the book she hid it in, which is a story of its own. Miriam and David told us about how they felt wearing the star.
You were a non-person, a person people didn't want to associate with. You were different. Maybe you were bad because the Germans said Jews are bad. It makes you feel like you are nothing.
We were marked.
On July 5th, 1942, summons were sent to 4,000 Jews to report for transport to camps in the East. And in the Netherlands, Jews had few options for escape because of geography and other reasons. The activities of the resistance workers included hiding 28,000 Jews, although 40,000 were seeking hiding places. It's important to mention that those who were in the resistance were remarkable and incredibly brave, but they were a really small group of non-Jewish Dutch citizens. Out of the 8.8 million citizens, there were about 45,000 who helped, which is 0.5% of the population. So these stories of resistance and helping people hide are amazing, and I am so thankful for the many people who helped our family, but I think it's important to have that statistic.
My father was amazing. He planned and insisted that we hide. He just totally saw that the whole thing was very dark, and he was obviously right. My mother's sister Jet and her husband thought that as long as they did exactly what the Germans said, then they'd be okay. They went when they were told to go for the transport. They went with their 2 kids, including their oldest daughter, my best friend. They went and they never came back.
And I forgot to mention that the photograph we were looking at here is my mother Miriam's cousins, Miriam and Hetty, and Miriam, the older girl, was her best friend, and they had the same name. So then we get to the chapter titled Invisible, where we learn about the narrator's long-term hiding places, where they were invisible for more than 2 years. And the timeline that opens this chapter and many of the others tells about parallel moments in the narrator's lives, and then also in what was happening politically and with the society and with the war. Also at the start of the hiding chapter is a map of hiding addresses with 27 documented hiding addresses for the 8 narrators, because in the beginning they had to move around so much for various reasons, like raids in the neighborhood or people couldn't afford to keep them. And this is where the structure of the book changes. The voices are no longer interwoven, and we have the separate chapters for each narrator. And those separate chapters and the fact that there's these 8 narrators is also a key factor in the educational project, because their hiding experiences are so very different from one another. And often we think of the situation with Anne Frank, and that's what many students know about hiding, that you hid with your whole family and you never left the hiding place. In this, just in a summary of the variety of hiding situations with my family members, is that there were Nazi raids on 2 of the hiding places. My maternal grandparents in the church were not discovered, and my paternal grandfather was. Most of the protectors were remarkable humanitarians, and some were not. And one hiding story of my Uncle Natan is filled with an adventure, and another of my Aunt Judith has sort of horrors upon horrors. Before hiding, the 3 Dazuta girls had their braids cut and their names changed because it made them look less Jewish, just present as less Jewish. They were told not to cry because the departure had to look as normal as possible. Miriam wrote about the sleeping arrangements at the home of Nell Van Fleet, where she hid with 3 other Jewish children.
For a short while, we slept in regular beds in different rooms. Then the Germans started to unexpectedly search homes for hidden weapons, hidden Jews, and hidden pilots. It became too dangerous at night. The four of us had to sleep under the kitchen floor because you couldn't get to a hiding place fast enough. Every night at 7 for the remaining years of the war, more than 2 years, we said goodnight, and the four of us went down into our little night prison.
This is the teddy bear that my Aunt Judith had the whole time she was in hiding. The Dezuta girls had to change hiding places multiple times, and eventually their parents lost track of where they were. Sometimes they suffered from lack of food and they were always in danger. Judith had to leave the home where she was hiding with three older women because of increased raids in the neighborhood. And at that point, she was taken to a farm owned by a family with 8 children. And she did not, of course, know yet about the abuse that she was about to endure. When Judith realized that our book would be published, she made the difficult decision to share her complete story. She had written it out and she planned to leave it for her daughters to read after her death. But she, at the point of, almost publication, decided to share it with us. And this is the back of a photograph of that farming couple that hid Judith. In the front of, in the photograph on the other side, you can see them receiving recognition for hiding her. And here on the back, in Judith's handwriting, you could read the crimes of the father and his 2 sons. And this is an excerpt from Judith's letter about what happened. The last family I was hiding with was where it happened. The father and 2 of his sons, 16 and 17 years old, abused me. There was nothing I could do and nobody I could go to. I never told my parents. Years after, Poppy submitted their names to the righteous list in Yad Vashem. And sometime later, they sent us a letter with pictures of the ceremony in the Israeli consulate, where they got a medal and a certificate and trees planted in their name for saving a Jewish life. In 2016, Judith's daughters, my 2 cousins and I, requested that this person be removed from the righteous at Yad Vashem. I met with the director of the department and gave her Judith's written account. They took it really seriously. They had their board and a judge review the case, and his name was removed. And now I'm trying to get his name removed from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum that Colleen found there when she was visiting with her family. 7 years after the visit to the Rotterdam church and opening the Holocaust store, I found this drawing that my grandfather Chaim made of the hiding place in the church. It accompanied his account of a terrifying Nazi raid that took place in April of 1945, so just a month before liberation. At that point, my grandparents had been in this attic hiding for 2 years. And here's an excerpt from his account.
I hear someone walking through the church, so I go over to the window from where the organist has full view. Carefully, I hold the edge of the opaque green curtain against the wall and use my finger to create a small crack, only to grow rigid with fear. On the podium below me, between the pews, there are 2 green police walking around, searching everything. And then comes the stage of paralysis, the sense that all is lost.
When I was there in 2006, I stood in that same place in the organ loft where my grandfather stood 61 years earlier. And during a moment alone, I pulled back the curtain to look into the nave, just as he had when he saw the Nazi police searching between the pews. 75% of Jews in the Netherlands were murdered, and the majority of those who were able to survive did so by hiding. When when they came out of hiding and they were reunited in the chapter titled After, this is when their voices are interwoven again. And although they emerged, 7 of the 8 of them, the lives they had no longer existed. Other people were living in their homes. Years of education had been lost. They couldn't relate to old friends or family members, and David's father, Erwin, didn't return. In the top row here are the the children before the 1940 German occupation on the bottom row, after 1945, after liberation. And it really strikes me that they had gone into the war and into hiding as children, and they came out as adults.
We really didn't know how bad things were until after the war. Then came the really sad times. Many people were waiting for their family, their husbands, their children to come back, and they didn't come back. Every time they heard about someone who didn't come back, my parents were crying, and they were always whispering. Everything was sad, and you felt guilty because you didn't get killed.
A few years ago, in the basement of my mother's cousin's house, a film was discovered that brought the happy pre-war Dezuta girls to life. Statistically, it's remarkable that of the 8 narrators in Invisible Years, 7 survived. Um, and though they did, when they came out of hiding, they learned that 61 close family members were murdered, and this list remembers them. The youngest was 6 years old, and the oldest was 72. These are words from my grandfather, Erwin's memoir, written shortly before he was murdered in Auschwitz.
In the end, I hope that my lines will be read by people who will see how we struggled under terrible circumstances, and that the reader will want to take up the struggle that we have fought and experienced from the front lines for the construction of a worthwhile, humane society.
So when Colleen and I were creating the first Invisible Years classroom project, she turned Erwin's words into the essential question for the class, for the project.
How can we see struggles fought and experienced by others in order to construct a more worthwhile and humane society?
So circling back to the 3 parts of the project, we start with the stories of my family members that you now have a sense of from the first part of the presentation. And those stories are linked to the Holocaust history. And then in the first working class, students gather in small groups to carry out a reading of the narrator's interwoven voices, kind of like Colleen and Joe and I were doing, but we have the narrators, and then they get in groups of 5, 6, or 7, and everyone takes a voice, and they read aloud for 20 to 40 minutes, depending on the class. And one student described the reading aloud experience like this. She said, "We are reading for them, speaking for them. They are in our body." And it's quite remarkable to see what happens. They seem a little awkward and uncomfortable when they start the reading process. And then, it's kind of like reading a play, and they just are really drawn into the lives of the narrators. Here are some of the students in a small group reading, and we ask them to highlight circumstances that stand out to them and jot down questions for discussion that we then have following the reading. After the students read together, they choose one narrator to follow into hiding. At this point, they have a sense of the narrators from reading the first interwoven chapters, and we give them a paragraph summary of each of the narrators' hiding experiences. So they can choose the narrator whose hiding story is of interest to them, or the narrator speaks to them, or maybe it was the person they connect with. During the project, students learn how to ask good questions from their narrators through some workshops that we do. from the narrator's stories, photographs, and artifacts. And they use these questions in an interview with me and my cousins, Sharon and Hadassah, who are the daughters of Natan and Judith. And these are just a few, the questions are remarkable. And these are just because, they really know the narrators at this point. And so these are just a few to give you a sense. When Judith wrote the letter to you about the abuse that she experienced in hiding, how did you feel? How did this shape your view of the war and the cost of survival? How did David's experience of human kindness during his hiding shape his perspective on humanity as a whole? Why did Natan feel safer with the yellow star when it was essentially a target on his back? In all of the 9 classes I've done, we've had really profound conversations during the interview period. The students' questions, as I mentioned, are really informed because they really know the history and the people who experienced it. By the time they're formulating the questions, they've learned how to ask good questions, and they're really challenged by the answers. Then we asked the students to what would they say to their narrator if they could. And again, so they've really connected, and we asked them to write a letter to the person that they followed into hiding. And the letters are just remarkable. And Colleen's going to read, right? Colleen, are you going to read this one from one of her students?
Erwin Geismar. To be frank, I am unsure how satisfied you would be with society's current progress towards being more humane. Human rights have greatly increased over the past 80 years, yet there are still many groups who are treated poorly. There are genocides going on that no one seems to particularly care about. As you may be able to tell, your story has had a great impact on me. On the surface, I have little connection with you. You spoke a different language, lived across the world, were over 20 years older than I currently am. You had a wife and a child while I obviously have neither. However, your writing voice truly speaks to me because it resembles my own, and I share your hopes and worries for the future and how we'll change. Xavier.
In part 2 of the project, we move to the present, looking at how things are going on in our world now. And in the early days of the COVID shutdown, during a Zoom presentation, I experienced anti-Semitism firsthand. And I share that experience with the students. I'm going to show a screenshot after this from the anti-Semitic Zoom bombing. First, someone shouted, "Ha ha, the Holocaust never happened." And then the hackers drew swastikas and wrote "kill Jews" and other hateful words on the presentation, which meant they were writing on my family members' diaries, letters, and photographs. So after I share that experience, in more detail than I just shared with you, I tell the students how it felt to have this happen and how the only control I had was in how I responded. And that the reason I was able to go on with the presentation was because friends and colleagues and strangers supported me both in the moment and after. And I talk about why Holocaust denial is so dangerous, and of course the increase in anti-Semitic incidents and also anti-Muslim hate, especially since October 7th. And the students are always shocked and sad and angry, but not surprised. Then we ask the students if they want to share their experiences with discrimination, both online in their school and also in their community. And again, in all the 9 classes I've taught this far, they have so much to share. And it's a day where they don't want the discussion to end because they are so appreciative of this thoughtful space to have this conversation. And Colleen and Joe are amazing collaborators and teachers in facilitating this with students who really trust them. We talk about how they can respond to the things that happen to them. how they can reject what the person is saying in a way that's true to themselves, which we point out would be very different than how a teacher or adult would respond. And then in the last phase of the project, students apply their learning to a modern human rights conflict, selecting from a list that we provide or coming up with their own, running it by their classroom teacher. Many students have a situation in their own family history that they want to explore. And they write a short summary of their conflicts, create their own interwoven narrative from primary sources, and then ask questions from their interwoven narrative, just as I did with my family members' stories that I then linked to history. And they pick two of their questions to link to historical briefs that they research. These are some of the events that students have worked with. And after they complete their projects, they present to one another in small groups. And then in the last class, it all comes together with students identifying patterns that exist between the human rights conflicts or atrocities that they were focusing on and the Holocaust. And they give specific examples from the many atrocities that they've just learned about and sort of come up with these patterns and then also possible solutions. And here you can see a few of the solutions in purple and the patterns in black. And then I'm going to end, and I know that Joe has to leave, and so I think we're going to have maybe 5 minutes before Joe has to leave. But with the last slide is one student's response to the project, and we do ask them for feedback. We've used their feedback to make the project better, and this is what one student had to say. The discussion on the last day of class was helpful in connecting everything we learned to our own lives. I have taken the message and information about human rights conflicts out of the box of Euro and broadened it to the scope of my day-to-day life. This project had a huge impact on my way of thinking of the world. So that's a quick-ish summary of the book that developed into this project together with the collaboration of Joe and Colleen, and Joe has to leave in about 5 minutes, so he's going to go first and just maybe say a few words about what it was like for him to bring this to his classroom, and then Colleen, and then we can take questions.
Daphne, thanks. It just happens that I had Ellery in class today. She's in a civics class now with me, and we were discussing the results of the election, and I still hear, in my mind, the comments that she's making, and there's just so much maturity and there's so much ability for her to connect what's happening in the world around her today to the past, and you had a huge impact on her. So I appreciate that you selected her note there. I'll say a couple things. I actually pulled up a student wrote a news article about your collaboration with the students at E.O. Smith, and there's a section of it that I want to read out that I think captures a little bit of the collaboration that you had with the students here. So this was written by Hannah Adams, who's one of the students in the class at the time we were working together, and she said, in Geismar's time at EO, she spoke about her process of writing, her personal stories, artifacts, and she helped students better understand the Holocaust and its effects on individuals. Genocide students were presented with excerpts from her book and assigned tasks relating to it. Students were asked to write a letter as if they were writing to one of the family members, and they were asked to read family members' personal hiding stories. Both assignments helped students gain perspective on the Holocaust. The final project of the unit included a brief history write-up of a genocide that has occurred, and the students' version of an interwoven narrative between their chosen genocide and Geismar's invisible years. In the assignment, students became experts on world issues and were able to discuss them. And they also found similarities between the Holocaust and other genocides. By finding similarities, the students grew their understanding of how to identify hate in our society today. and its potential to grow into violence that creates humanitarian issues. During Geismar's time at EO, students also learned valuable skills and developed a deeper understanding of human rights. And so I would just sort of add here that I think the real power of the collaboration we had was in not only helping students to better understand the past, but helping them appreciate how it still relates today. And unfortunately, your example of the anti-Semitic Zoom bombing was a very, as disappointing as it was a very artful way of making the connection and showing students without telling them that the ideas of the Nazis have not been vanquished. And so students were able to see how those ideas still challenge them in the world around them today. And just a couple other things that I would say, and it was just became very obvious to me, if it's not already clear just from the presentation, Daphne's incredibly organized and incredibly knowledgeable about the history that we're working through here. And she had this incredible ability of making connections with students and relating her own family stories to the questions they had. So I think, Daphne, you remember that students were particularly interested in the fake identification that some of your family used. Was it Miriam whose identification card you brought into class?
It was actually my grandmother, my father's mother, Kreta, and she was the one who was hiding in plain sight as a maid, and so she had a false ID with her picture, but somebody else's name, and that allowed her to move around and in plain sight. Yeah, and the students were fascinated with that idea of a fake ID.
They absolutely, yeah, they were. And then that, and there's a picture of it that I have here, but Daphne, you brought in the fake ID, and you could just feel the energy in the room when students held that card that possibly saved her life. So having that piece of history to actually hold in your hands and to see is a really powerful way, on top of all of the other great elements there, a really powerful way um, of learning about this important history. So I thought it had a terrific impact on the students, and I'm excited to have you come back and visit again soon. I'm looking forward to that. So
We start
uh,
next week.
I'm looking at it. I can't wait.
um, yeah, so I'm always kind of blown away by how how meaningful it is to bring in the actual documents, the star, the book, the fake ID, the memoir, especially after the students know what they represent and know the people and the stories behind them. And they've seen them, in PDFs or in printouts. But the day towards the end of the class, when I bring in the actual objects, it is just one more thing that really seems to draw the students. And thanks, Joe, so much for squeezing this in and for your thoughts. And I should I think I have a copy of your students' write-up, but I have a really difficult time summarizing this project, so I can use her summary too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Colleen.
Hi. I would echo so much of what Joe said. I've been teaching for 20 years. This is my 20th year, and this collaboration has truly been probably the most meaningful teaching that I think I've ever done. Um, I've also been teaching about the Holocaust for 20 years in lots of different courses and in different capacities. And I felt like I was doing a pretty good job prior to working with Daphne. I made sure we had, primary sources, survivor testimony, a lot of video testimony. But then when I did my first collaborative project with Daphne, the way that my students felt such a connection to the history was unbelievable. I think a lot of that had to do with like Daphne being so present and so engaged in the process. They felt really empowered and special. I think that they kept saying, an author is coming to work with us. Like, we're going to meet with her and we're going to get to work with her and she's going to give us feedback. and that they felt that she trusted them with such personal information, and really she trusted them with her family's story legacy. I think that that was really empowering to them, and it made them connect to the information in such a more deep and emotional way. And a lot of the feedback that we got afterwards was that, they knew it, they understood what happened, they grasped the content, but they didn't have that emotional connection to it in the way that they did after completing this project. To echo also something that Joe said, the power of the physical objects. Last year, Daphne brought a collection in, and I had many students who really gravitated towards Irwin's story. So they couldn't believe like they were able to actually pick up his journal and touch those pages that he touched. And then she also brought in the Jewish Star. And because that is something that is, part of kind of more mainstream knowledge or taught in a lot of history classes, and they've seen it in museums, and in books, but they got to hold it. They looked at me and they were like, I have chills. I can't believe that I can hold this piece of history that they were so familiar with. It was just so powerful. Another element that I thought was really cool was a lot of my students actually had a family history that connected to the Holocaust in some way. And in that third part of the project where they did their own research, we did let some of the students conduct interviews with family members and create their own kind of version of Invisible Years and think for the first time really about how this history impacted their lives. And one of my students knew that her grandparents were Holocaust survivors, but had never really spoken to them about it because that just wasn't, the way of their family to discuss it. And she asked her mom for permission, and they actually called. And it was such an important, meaningful experience for her, getting to know her own family history and connecting to her grandparents that way and connecting with her mom that way. So it wasn't just educationally powerful and valuable, it was really emotionally valuable for them as well.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Working with Colleen is like the highlight of my life, I have to say. I, the fact that we worked together on the first project, and it was one of those perfect collaborations where we each were coming from such different places, and the parts were the whole were greater than the parts, and I learned so much about how to interact with students in in these situations where we're having really difficult really challenging conversations, really sensitive conversations. Colleen is a master of that, and the fact that I was able to work with Colleen for the first three classes at the same time that we ever taught, I could then, Colleen can now take this project and teach it without me, and I can take all that I've learned from Colleen about teaching and interacting with high school students and bring it to the other classes that I am involved in. So thank you so much, Colleen, and I really appreciate that you shared your thoughts with everyone here.
Thank you so much, Daphne and Colleen, and I know Joe hopped off. Um, I think this is the perfect time to open to any questions or comments about the project. Um, and I think maybe just my own reaction to this is that the success that you've had with students, um, and the level of connection that you've achieved with this, I think really signals, you know, perhaps a change in the approaches that we need to look at, when it comes to Holocaust and genocide education. This isn't the most traditional approach, but it's taking some of those traditional aspects and really honing in on meaning and finding the tools to respond to history and to current events at the same time. So I do think I think this project really signals a change in direction in how we need to approach Holocaust and genocide education. So I think you've really set an interesting foundation for us to explore going forward. Um, I do want to open it up to the audience. If anyone has any comments or questions that they'd like to add, please feel free.
Kim, I'd like to make a statement. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Daphne. My name is Ruth Weiner. I am you. If you are a 2G, I'm a 1G.
Nice
Uh,
to meet you.
I'm a survivor. I'm also an educator by profession, and I've been in touch with literally thousands and thousands of kids over many, many years. And I'm telling you all that because I'm about to give you a huge compliment, and I want you to know how huge it is. This is not coming from nowhere. Um, Two things. One is that whenever I'm in front of a group, I go out of my way to make very clear to them that the story I'm about to tell them is my story, and it's uniquely my story, and they need to understand that. But what they also need to understand at the same time is that it's a universal story. And your head is going up and down, and that, I think, is the main message that you've delivered so very, very effectively with what you've done. You've used every magic ingredient that there is, the personal involvement, your great creativity, your great ability at communicating and communicating in ways that are special and specific to what you're communicating. But I think the utmost thing is the sincerity and the depth of what you're communicating. And my hat is off to you, and I can see why it's so successful and why the people that you've been working with have become partners with you. But the second thing I want to say is very, very personal. Uh, I'm sitting here identifying all over the place with this story. If I weren't too lazy, I would go get you a teddy bear that looks almost exactly like the teddy bear that you had. I could get you a memoir written by my grandfather as he sat in the ghetto in Vienna before he was taken away to Riga to be put to death. Very similar comments to the ones that you've got. I could show you pictures of family members, some of whom in hiding, some of whom getting bombed in England and Coventry and almost killed. But so also some very hair-raising stories, very parallel, very parallel the stories. But what's hard for me to communicate, and I'll try, is the sense that I have of will somebody ever take all of those stories? I have not done it. I have not done it. And I feel very guilty about it. But will somebody else of my family, my children, my grandchildren, have the kind of dedication and the kind of inspiration that you did uh, to develop it in the way that you did? So again, my hat is off to you. You're an amazing person, and you've done an amazing job. And I hope there are more like you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was the biggest gift that your thoughts and feedback. And are you in Connecticut?
I'm in Bloomfield, yeah.
Okay. So we'll have to get together so I can see the teddy bear and the memoir, and
Okay,
you
I'd
can tell
love
me
that.
more.
I would love that.
Thank you so much.
Daphne, if you want to come down to Wilton, Ruth will be speaking on the 18th. And even though it's sold out, I think they're moving it to a bigger room. So I will be in touch
have you
with
heard
Okay.
anything more? Have you heard anything more from her?
just that they sold out of 150
Yeah,
spots.
amazing.
Yeah. So,
And maybe
Thank
just to
you.
tag on to what Ruth said, if you've ever seen Ruth present at a school, um, she also completely centers the students in her approach. And I think that's also something that is very similar between the both of you is that this project and the way Ruth approaches her own story is that she really centers the students and their curiosities and their interests and the things that they specifically want to know about this history. So I think you have that also in common, the both of you as educators. You've won their hearts in that way, which I think is just really lovely.
Very, very quick, if I may, very quick explanation, Daphne. What I do is any group that I'm involved with is I work with the teachers to develop a set of questions that the kids submit to me. And we do two things. One is whatever I present, I respond to those questions. The other is we have a panel, a little panel selected by the kids, and I interact with that panel, and it becomes a
Very personal.
Q&A situation. And that's what Kim is describing.
Mm.
Right, Kim?
Yes, exactly. And it is also magic to watch it happen. It is both practical and also very, very meaningful as well. Um, and I have two questions. Maybe
Bef-
speaking of
I just want to
practicality.
thank
Yeah.
Colleen. I think Colleen has to go. So I'm going to say goodbye and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.
And I'll see you soon.
Bye.
And yeah, so Ruth, it sounds like you were making those personal connections that the kids are coming to the talk in an informed way. And that all goes such a long way.
That it becomes personal.
Yeah. Sorry, Kim, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, of course not. I said you are the star tonight. So, but maybe just a couple of practical questions, because we will be sharing this, in afterwards, for those who are going to tune in later. Could you describe maybe the timeline of the process of working with a teacher, from first contact to the last session, and maybe just a brief overview of that?
Yeah. So it varies depending on the interests and needs and possibilities of the teacher and the class and the schedule. Joe and Colleen's classes both, were quite long. I think maybe someone here used the word in depth. Um, that's something I'm really thinking about with this project. It's very in depth, and a teacher that was really skeptical about spending that much time at the beginning, who I worked with, a teacher named John, he, at the end of the class, was almost in tears about the work that the students did, and he said, it was a year-long class. This was the best work he'd ever seen from them. And I said, well, I know you were concerned about the length. How might what would you do to make it shorter? And he said, you could make it shorter, but the deep empathy and the deep learning wouldn't happen. That said, I'm working with right now with New Haven Academy, which is down the street from where I live, and it's a Facing History in Ourselves class. And they have 5 sessions, and they have students who aren't quite as far along in their learning as the students that I worked with, Colleen and Joe. So Meredith Gavrin and I are writing creating a new project with the pieces that I showed you today, but it's going to be 5 sessions, and everything we do is going to be a little bit edited down and shorter. And because of the Facing History class, rather than the students focusing on world human rights atrocities or genocides. They're going to be doing their own sort of final project on other issues of hate. And so it's kind of the same idea of history, present, students going through the interwoven narrative and linking it to history process, but in a very different way and in a shorter way. So Meredith had a sense of my project. She gave me a sense of what she was interested in doing, and then we brainstormed together, and then I put together an outline and ran it by her. And now we're kind of, through email working together to finalize all the pieces. So uh, she's fairly involved. Teachers are super busy and they don't have time for outside planning. So in many cases, a teacher will, again, have a sense of the project, will tell me what is possible, and then I will make a proposal. So I'm doing most of the curriculum, the project planning, but they have the deep knowledge about the class, and they might suggest some sources, or like originally in Joe's class, it was a genocide class, so there were specific topics he wanted to focus on for that final project, whereas in Kathleen's it was a much more wide open process. So if somebody wanted to do the project, that is very similar to either the 10-week or 5-week project that I'll now have in place, there wouldn't be all that much pre-planning. And also what I do is I have a draft teacher guide with links to all the resources. And before every class, even with Joe and Colleen on the second rounds, I will, like the day or two before, I'll send them the pieces and say, this is what we're doing, this is part one, and this is what the students are going to, need printed out today. And this is today's lesson plan. And so I try to do what I can to make it as streamlined for the teacher as possible. So they don't have to do a lot of additional work, but they have as much input as they want. And I really think it's important for it not to be a cookie cutter mold, for it to be adapted to every teacher and every class.
Okay, thank you. I think that brings us to the end of our session today. But if anybody else has comments or questions, of course, you're more than welcome. So thank you all for being here, and please get in touch with us at the Hero Center or Voices of Hope to talk about getting you in touch with Daphne. And maybe Daphne, and maybe we can do another session sometime where you can talk us through how you pieced all of those very small pieces of paper together to create an entire book. I was looking at one of those very slim one sentence slips of paper, and it must have been quite an experience really putting this book together for the first time. So maybe we can do a deep dive into that next time.
We're also focused on our monitors, and doing it, cutting and pasting in our monitors. That cutting and pasting in real life just doesn't happen anymore. And I have to work pretty hard to get the students to go through that process. So but I can just do it in the computer.
Amazing. Okay. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Daphne. I hope we can bring your story and your family story into some new schools this year. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, Daphne.
You, Kim.
Bye.
Good to see you, everybody.
Robin.
Nice to meet you,
Daphne. To meet you, Ruth.